I was confused there for a second because I have the YouTube video was playing in the background. I couldn't find the tab because I've got so many tabs open. So I didn't know if I was in this when the countdown ended here versus when it ended.
What a terrible way to start off.
So
get it together, man.
So what is this? Part one of this video is from about 3 or 4 months ago. I think it December or January, December 2024 or January 2025. I can't remember. On Lance's channel, so check it out there. And what that is a review and response for a video Emerson Green did on some arguments for epistemic privacy, which is, you know, this kind of concept in philosophy of mind. It has some weight in terms of the types of arguments people give for phenomenal consciousness. It also has some import in topics like philosophy of language or philosophy of like visual perception, things like that. So Lance and Pete went through sort of the first third of this, and I was very excited to see the rest, but there was no rest that I could find. So, you know, I got in touch with them both, and we're doing part two now. And yeah, feel free if either of you want to say anything just before we kind of jump into the video. Bonus too. Yeah, okay. Right, well, I'll just start playing it then, and we can, you know, let me know if you want to pause or anything, and we will do that. I'm going to bring the StreamYard tab down here too.
Would it, you know what? Can you pause? Maybe it's worthwhile to,
yes,
if I were to like briefly synopsize kind of what came before, in case people haven't watched the first Lance and Pete video or have and completely forgot it.
Yeah. Good idea.
In December of the previous year. So my foggy recollection of what we covered was one idea being that there's this general kind of phenomenon you might call epistemic asymmetry with respect to things that are mental and things that aren't mental. And then there's this additional question of like, well, how much asymmetry do you need to get the kind of privacy that seems to really find itself at these various controversies in philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, epistemology. And so the more general notion of just an epistemic asymmetry with respect to one's mental states, you could put by saying like, well, you know, there's all sorts of epistemic relations we could bear to things. You can, you know, have knowledge of something. You can have justification for believing in that thing. There's other things that are epistemic. And then the asymmetry is something along the lines of, with respect to my own mental states, or maybe specific mental states of mine, like my phenomenal states, like, you know, smelling the color red or feeling intense pain, whatever, tripping out. Do I know that better than you do? Or do I know it in a more direct way? Or do I have justification for it that is different from your justification you might have? So these are the epistemic asymmetries. And maybe no one denies that there's at least some asymmetry. Like, for example, I know stuff about what's going on in my house right now that you two don't know. And I could gain more knowledge about that stuff in a way that's easier than the way you would gain knowledge about it, because I'm here. I could do things like just turn my head and look and see what's on that shelf over there, where you might be stuck having to listen to my testimony and then do some kind of inference like, well, is Mandik pulling our leg right now? So those are what you might say are like vanilla epistemic asymmetries. But the really interesting ones and controversial ones are ones that we might say like, oh, do I know stuff about my own mental states that it would be impossible for anyone else to know? Or do I have a kind of direct access or a certain kind of warrant that no one could possibly have because they're not me? That gets us into the more controversial territory. And to my knowledge, when philosophers say like, oh, we reject privacy, what they're rejecting are these more extreme claims. like that it's absolutely impossible, or there's some some like real like threshold that can't be crossed, as opposed to a threshold that is just difficult to cross, right? So like on some versions of physicalism, it's easier for you to know if you stub your toe than it is for me, because your toe is connected to your brain and my toe isn't connected to my brain. The only like access I have to your toe is by like looking at it or smelling it, and I'm only gonna like work my way to your pain via a series of inferential steps that either you don't have to go through at all, or you don't go through consciously. You just like stub your toe, and then like a little bit later, like ow, like shit. Where it's open for the physicalist to say, given that what is happening in you is fully physical, I could theoretically just like scan your nervous system, and I might know that you have stubbed your toe and are going to be suffering pain before you know. Because it's really just this brain event, and it won't percolate up into the conscious parts of your brain until a little bit later. So I might, in some sense, have, at least theoretically, better access to whether you're in pain or not, and maybe even the quality of your pain than you do. So these kind of privacy claims kind of end up falling along different debates, like, for example, between physicalists and anti-physicalists. Some arguments for anti-physicalism seem to have loaded into their premises that there are these very strong epistemic asymmetries. So one of the things that I think we talked about last time was this general point that, like, well, maybe there is a kind of thin asymmetry, but it's like the asymmetry of like me knowing about the inside of my house versus you knowing about the inside of my house. Not really metaphysically deep, not really impossible for you to know what's going on inside of my house, just difficult. And I think we also touched a little bit on a kind of argument that Emerson is going to make in the video, where he's going to present some of what he's saying as inference to the best explanation. He, in the part of the video that Lance and I watched together, he kind of signaled that that's where he was going, but he didn't get to the full dress argument. But I floated an idea early on in the previous video that perhaps his inference to the best explanation isn't really giving the best explanation, because it's not giving an explanation at all. It's just restating the phenomenon. So the phenomenon is allegedly there are these epistemic asymmetries, and then the explanation is, well, that there's this privacy. But if privacy is just a label for these epistemic asymmetries, then it's not an explanation. You're just restating what the data is. So I flagged that, and I think we discussed that a little bit, but that's mostly what we did and where we left off.
I tell you what, I think there's maybe even something, as you were saying, that where to try to be a little bit sympathetic towards motivating it is like an inference to the best explanation. I'm thinking it's almost like, I don't know, you see a bunch of brown dogs or something, so you generalize to like, well, all dogs are brown. And that is like, in a sense, right, it's a slightly more different claim than like the 10 dogs I saw are brown or something, right? There is a difference, but
right.
The question is, like, the additional part of the explanation isn't that only part of that is sufficient for the evidence that you've seen, and there's a large amount of like uncertainty over all of the stuff that's new in that explanation, if that makes sense. Like, it's not background data that like all dogs are a certain color or something, or does that...
Right. So in your specific example with the dogs, you've made an abductive inference. You have gone beyond the data. The data is, this particular set of dogs is brown. And you're not just saying, oh, the reason these dogs are brown is because these dogs are brown. That would be a circular explanation. That's no explanation at all. You are making this abductive leap to this generalization. All dogs are brown. So not just these dogs are brown, but now you're sticking your neck out and saying, like, if there's other dogs out there, they're brown also. And that might be false. And we could attempt to falsify that by finding a dog and then seeing if it's non-brown or not. So what you would want in an inference, the best explanation, is for the explanation, the thing that you're making an abductive inference to have some different content from the data, not just be renaming the data. And by the way, I should say, I'm not convinced that Emerson is committing this crime. I was just floating that.
Yeah.
Maybe he's innocent.
I guess what I'm wondering is what does that look like then in the case of asymmetry, if there is like a specific, if there is to be a specific explanation there, like what is the additional content, right? I mean, presumably it's this stronger sense of asymmetry. The asymmetry in principle couldn't be traversed by anyone else. Couldn't be overcome by someone from a different perspective or something. Would that be?
Yeah. So I guess it depends on how you state what the data is in the first place. So one way you might state the data is that there's these particular cases and there's these particular difficulties that we encounter. And then the abductive leap, the thing that goes beyond that, might be to say, like, well, maybe it's just impossible. Or in all such cases, there's always going to be this thing that's left out. So that would be more than just a restatement of the data.
I was just, I realized I forgot to do Lance Loot as well, Lance. I'm sorry. Do you want to give out the Lance Loot to your audience, or?
Oh, I already did.
Okay. So yeah, I've messed up this stream so badly. I just jumped into it, didn't do the countdown properly.
Just jumped in.
Didn't do the Lance Loot. Cool. Okay. Already. Okay. So if I bring back up the video, wherever that, not that view. Not maybe that view, and we play it a little bit, then we can see a little bit more of what Emerson has to say then about this argument.
So, summing up the epistemic asymmetry argument, I
know we're always getting criticized for pausing too often and commentating on stuff. Fun fact about Emerson's audio, it's a microphone I sold him, I think, that he's using. So there you go.
Well, it sounds good.
Submit that it is easier to doubt the consciousness of others than it is to doubt the existence of my own consciousness. Radical stuff, I know.
Yeah, this was something I remembered actually when I was listening to you two in the previous episode. There was something you articulated, and what came to my mind was, I think it was when you said this is like a Cartesian sort of argument that Descartes makes, that there's like certain properties that his own mind has of like being knowable by him versus like other people's minds aren't like that. And yeah, it's like is it called like masked man fallacy or something like that? Is there an official name for it? Like if a man comes to you in a mask, then it'd be like, well, I don't know who the masked man is, but I do know who my father is, so the masked man can't be my father, sort of thing.
Yeah, so it often gets called the intentional fallacy.
Right.
So intentional with an S. One way to put it is, I don't know that, right? I believe that this person's not my father. I believe my father's never worn a mask. This person is wearing a mask. Therefore, this person can't be my father. If you're attributing a property to these separate individuals outside of an intentional with an S context, then you would have a valid application of Leibniz law, which part of which is like, if X has a property that Y lacks, then X is non-identical to Y. But what's happening inside of the context where you're talking about what you believe or what you've said is you can't draw inferences. In some sense, you're not really talking about real properties. You're just talking about like what you think about what's going on, and what you think about what's going on has no consequence for what's really going on. So I know that Hesperus is over there. I don't know that Venus is over there. So therefore, whatever is over there isn't Venus. That's a crappy argument, because who cares what you know or don't know?
I'm thinking that there's something interesting going on in these intentional cases, though, which is it's something like, okay, that makes sense, right? Where I'm sort of like, where I have this myself and my subjectivity and the world on the other hand kind of model, right? Because the intentional context is like an epistemic context, right? But in this case, what Emerson is doing is talking about the epistemic context itself, right? Which is, there's almost like a slight subtle difference maybe between, like, you know, these Hesperus, Phosphorus kind of cases where it maybe it's not even, it's not like there's, well, I don't know. I don't exactly know how he's gonna. I mean, and then maybe the answer is play the bloody video. But you know, I don't exactly know how he's gonna articulate this idea of sort of like looking on at an object and observing the asymmetry, or something like that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Or is
So
appealing to that? Yeah. Good.
a lot of the literature surrounding this stuff, and not just the stuff specifically about privacy, but also larger issues like, for example, as Emerson will get into, the zombie argument against physicalism. There's all this discussion that is designed by various parties to either pin someone on the intentional fallacy or the masked man fallacy, or to massage things so that you could dodge that accusation. And one sort of move that is often made by the people that are on Emerson's side, which is the side of saying there's this very strong privacy, we can conceive zombies, and therefore that's bad news for physicalism, is to deny that there's this kind of appearance reality distinction when it comes to consciousness. So one way this comes up in the literature is back with Kripke, who has this discussion of an early version of what we call modal arguments, where he's talking about, you know, how can there be necessary identities that appear to be contingent. So you take for example, the alleged identity, which is supposed to be supported by science, of heat and average molecular motion, or average molecular energy. That seems contingent, but if it's identical, it's necessarily identical. Like, you can't, in the Kripke system, you can't have contingent identities, but you can have apparent contingent identities. What would explain the appearance? And Kripke says, well, what explains the appearance of contingency is that you think of heat from the scientific point of view as mean molecular motion, and then you also think of heat from the sensory appearance point of view, from the sensation of heat. And those are contingently related. And that's how you get this appearance of contingency. But in reality, what heat really is just is mean molecular motion. So to, you know, be a little bit anachronistic and turn this into a zombie argument, it seems like, you know, for all we know, whatever's happening in a brain, that's just contingently related to consciousness. Could you make a similar move and say, like, well, what consciousness really is this brain activity, but the seeming is like the sensation of the brain activity? And then Kripke and people that follow Kripke will say, like, in the case of sensations, like, for example, the sensation of pain, there's no difference from seeming to be in pain and being in pain. And so you can't make the move that you did with explaining the the apparent contingency is merely apparent with the sensation of heat and real heat case. When we're talking about the sensation itself, the appearance just is the reality. And that kind of move to say that there's no difference between the appearance and reality shows up in lots and lots of anti-physicalist arguments under various guises. So Goff and others, they like revelation, and will say that like in having experiences or introspecting experiences, they just are able to like know the essence of the experience. And they need to say something like that, because otherwise their arguments are just either invalid or trivial.
You know, there's something interesting here to me as I'm hearing you articulate these views that you know, like I don't know, to denigratingly call them qualia freaks or people who are opposed to the based naturalist accounts of mind that we all subscribe to. You know, there's something in that where more recently my thinking has been, in a sense, sympathetic to some of the things that they're saying, right? Like some of the things that they're saying are like, no, like I do see red, like, you know, I do. Yeah, you know, they feel, I think, like we're denying those things. And my sense has been, oh no, I can kind of see what I think they think we're denying, but it's like they almost like build in this extra step where they kind of like reify the experience into like a thing, and then they like set themselves apart from it as like almost observing like a metaphysical different thing, to just like, no, instead of it just being like I just do see red, it's like, no, I also like almost stand side on and see the fact that I'm seeing red or something, like as a quail or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's I'm not sure that's the best diagnosis,
Sure.
but I think that's a somewhat fair way of describing what's going on. A lot of what makes these kinds of perennial philosophical problems so difficult, it's really a whole bunch of problems, and you kind of have to juggle a lot of balls all at once to sort it all out. You can't just focus on zombies and whether zombies are conceivable. You have to get into stuff like, well, what does conceiving even mean? Like, what does it mean to think about something? And what's the difference between referring to the thing and referring to the thing under a description? And is it always the case that when you refer to something, you're referring to it under a description? And what's knowledge, by the way? And you can't, and I said this to Lance in an earlier video, you can't just do a little bit of philosophy. You always have to do like all of it at once. You can't, and so like oftentimes it seems like we're onto something because we don't know the philosophy language we're trampling over, or we don't know the epistemology we're blowing off. We don't see how like the game has been rigged in certain ways by people like Kripke, who they do know all the different connections, and they are setting it up in such a way so that they have an escape route. And maybe you don't know all the stuff that he's put in, all the work he's put in behind the scenes so that he can have that escape route. But yes, so, you know, one way to get at a part of the problem here is in the case of like the Venus case, right? When we have cases where we distinguish between the thing and the way the thing is known or the way the thing is conceived of, oftentimes we could also point out different properties of one and the same thing. So in the classic example of discussing Venus, it's the morning star versus the evening star. So even though there's just ultimately in reality, there's just this one planet, it's the second planet in our solar system, there's these two different properties that one thing has. One of the properties is being the brightest thing in the brightest astronomical body visible in the morning, aside from the moon and the sun. And this other property, which is being the brightest luminous astronomical body besides the moon or the sun visible in the evening. Those are two different properties of one and the same thing. So it's tempting to go from this epistemic difference, the difference between conceiving it as the morning star versus conceiving it as the evening star, to this metaphysical difference between having this property rising in the morning versus this separate property rising in the evening. But in the case of like the sensation of pain, we're trying to talk about a property. We're not talking about a thing and whether the thing has two separate properties. We're talking about the property itself and whether that property, the property being painful, can be one and the same as the property of such and such activation in neurons. And how would you, how do you get a handle on what's going on in that case, since we don't have the move available to us that's available in the Venus case? We're talking about a property in the first place. When you suggest that the problem is we've reified something into a thing, I think a lot of people are going to say, no, we haven't. We're talking about a property. And the property. The question is this a physical property?
Well, as you were describing that like what my thought is sort of like screaming at me, what I've habituated myself into more recently is like when I'm hearing this kind of like property talk and stuff like and even the kind of like reality talk, like my mind's going like, hang on, something suspicious has happened, like already when we're talking about when we're saying but actually in reality, and I'm like, now watch carefully, like what's going on when we say that, because when we say that, what are we now doing? We're placing our statements in correspondence with one another, right, in our language. But are we placing sort of like concepts in correspondence with one, like mentally? Am I doing something? Well, I mean, maybe, right, under certain explanations of what might be going on. And similarly with the property talk, like, is there some, when I'm using this term property, like, am I actually identifying a general thing called a property that I think is common between all the things where I'm talking about property, or am I entering into like a discourse of using property where there are certain rules for how I raise that just because it's where my mind is going, but I realize that this will massively derail what maybe where this video is going as well. So feel free if you want to explore any of those, but
it's worth flagging the kind of worry that I hear you as expressing. And one way to flag that is to say, a lot of these debates seem to presuppose sides in other debates that are themselves controversial. So this stuff about, painfulness, the being painful and whether it could be such and such brain state, it's really hard to, and maybe even impossible, to even state what the worry is if you presuppose, for example, an purely extensional linguistic system like the kind advocated by Quine. Like, if all you allow yourself to quantify over are objects, one way to put it is like you're just a pure nominalist about so-called properties. There's no properties. There's things. And anything that you would want to feel tempted to go into property talk about, you could just retreat into predicate talk. And predicates are more things. They're things in a language that you could kind of replace with these other things, which are sets. But there's a way of, according to Quine, doing all the science you would ever need to do in a purely extensional idiom. And one of the things that gets ruled out, besides realism about properties, is also any kind of modal operators. So one way of kind of stating what this Quinean austerity is, in some ways, it's very much like Hume's austerity, right? Where one way of reading Hume is like the only thing you could really, the only sorts of things you could really talk about is like what's here now and available to the senses. So what's available to the senses is like these two events happened around the same time. And you don't get to say like the one caused the other, or one of them is counterfactually dependent on the other. All that is going beyond this concrete here and now experience situation. And so, yeah, there's lots of different ways to take a problem and sweep it under the rug, or just walk away from it. One of the ways to say like, well, I'm going to give up property talk.
Well, no, I don't know. Even if it's, I think even with the way, you know, the kind of like Quinian approach, which would be slightly different there. I think it's in my thinking where I'm leaning more towards pragmatism, in over the past sort of like year or two. You know, I'm thinking more than just of like, you know, I begin with using my words or something, right? So then I have to just pay attention to like, what am I actually doing as I'm talking about properties, and as that's the way that's where I'm leaning towards thinking when this kind of like talk is coming up, or similarly when the way that say someone like Quine might want to frame it in terms of like, you know, they talk about set theory and extensionality and stuff like that, like but then I'm like, hang on a second, what did I just do? And I kind of like watch myself and I'm like, well, I drew a little squiggly line like this for a set, and you know, and I said this word extensionality, and but like, have I like referred? Have I got beyond myself? Have I, you know, I'm kind of like watching. I'm just like, oh, I'm just producing activities and existing. And have I solved? Have I created or solved problems around? For me, I don't know. I feel like this I'm articulating things terribly, but this sort of pragmatist disposition for me is kind of just dissolving a lot of the problems in the first place. Like I really have to get in the mood of like, okay, I'm gonna play philosophy now, to like, you know, to be sat down with like, here's the position on one side, here's the position on the other side, here's a, yeah, I don't know, that not an argument, yeah.
I can relate to a lot of that, and part of what, you know, keeps me from not blowing my brains out is to just think of it as a kind of play, instead of like, oh, I've got to get the right answer or else I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
But more like kind of a little bit of play. And so, you know, if you and I were going to do some Shakespeare together, like, okay, you're going to be Othello, and now there's certain like rules of the game that we go along with, and there's still other things that we could figure out and negotiate within that, you know, common space. And so with a lot of this stuff, for example, like I just enter in and assume physicalism is true and do my best to defend that, even though I could easily switch to a different game space in which I appreciate that physicalism is really screwed up. And at the end of the day, I wouldn't want to say I'm a physicalist, because I don't think you could give any kind of useful global definition of physicalism. That's just ultimately, I think, still a silly project. But there's this local project that I think is very interesting, or local question. And the question is whether consciousness can be explained. So one way of getting into that is to play the game of properties, and to say like the so-called consciousness properties, can we explain them in the way that we generally accept that you explain things, by showing how they resolve into these separate properties that are individually not conscious, but when you put them together, they are. Can you pull that off? And what are the arguments against that? Are those arguments any good? And that's an enjoyable game to play.
Well, do you know what your explanation there sounded like to me was like almost like you know, Pete Mandik explains to a very autistic person how to communicate with with normal people who are doing philosophy to achieve their goals or something like that. So, you know, I'm on board with what you said. It's just kind of like funny from my point of view, like having to that I need some of the, I don't know, the social rules like spelled out for me about how it will be received by other people and things. So yeah.
Well, don't take anything I said as advice on how to get along with the other people, because I think a lot of the other people are assuming that they're doing something more than just messing around. They're assuming that there's certain things that are just obvious, and you're an idiot if you don't agree with them about those things. Normal people doing philosophy don't exist. A big agree. I would even go further and say normal people don't exist. Everyone's weird in an infinite number of ways. But hopefully we can make friends.
Right. So
find people that are weird in ways that you vibe with.
Lance is back. Hopefully he is full. I think we shall play a little bit of the video now. Finally, sorry guys.
How much have we gotten through so far? More like 30 seconds?
Yeah, something like that.
We're already going to get these ruthlessly critical comments. Nathan, you have the most critical critics.
I know.
What is like people in my videos are so nice. Oh, great. Now they're going to come over to my videos and start being critical.
No, because your audience is so nice.
Yeah, so, but you have people in your audience, and it's not that it's a bad thing to have critics, although I get a little snippy with them. Like it's good to have critics, but they're just it's always like you did the entire video wrong and I hate you.
Yeah.
And it's always something like that. And then it's like, if this is a pattern that you hate all of Nathan's videos, why are you watching them?
I think I brought it on myself. I think honestly, I've brought it on myself. I've realized this recently. It's because I spent so much time over the past 2 years worrying about like fascism and stuff that like I've been really seeking these people out and that the like types of content that they consume. And then I've realized what I've actually done is, you know, a lot of these people are being driven towards these views by algorithmic systems, and then they're like hate watching me and they just exist hate watching me. But yeah, that's another thing for another day.
This is not the channel to hate what, because like you'll do like you've done like 10-hour streams, right?
Yeah.
And people hate what? Like it's one thing to hate watch like a TikTok or short, but people, that's like dedicated hate watching.
It's okay. I think I tell myself that God is teaching me an important lesson about my moral failings through this. So yeah, right. Let's play. Oh, you go ahead.
Hold on before we play, because I haven't said anything. But you do. There is somebody in the chat that's pointing out. Someone was giving me a hard time because, like, in our last discussion, I said something about how I have no idea how like microphones and cameras work. And then they were like someone was really upset by this. Like they thought I was encouraging ignorance and like that, because like sometimes when I speak, I sound excited and I look happy. So I'm sitting here saying, I don't know shit about anything. I'm an ignorant idiot. And then they interpreted that as me saying like, hey, everyone, get excited about being a moron. Don't understand how anything works. Be a total ignoramus. Like that's a good way to be. And that's not what I'm doing. But that's how they interpreted it, and I thought that was a funny criticism. But one thing I will say about that is there is this thing called the illusion of explanatory depth, and this is the tendency for people to think that they have a pretty good idea about how things work, and they frequently don't. And when you start, digging past surface level of like what's a toaster, and you ask people like, okay, but like how does a toaster work? My guess is that the vast majority of people would be completely unable to explain. And apparently there's empirical data supporting this tendency for people to overestimate their understanding of how things work. And this isn't a question, because they had also made a comment about this, about how like to make a pencil or something, there might be 17 different types of industries and manufacturing. And like no one person in the line of manufacturing knows how all the other things work. It's not referring to that. It's just like, how do combustion engines work? How does a bicycle work? How does a plane work? Most people don't know about how most of these things work. And the only point that I have been trying to stress in these contexts is that there's a big difference between me as an individual not understanding something and the thing in question not being the sort of thing that it's possible for someone to understand because it's meaningless, because it's nonsensical. And what I don't do is go through the world thinking, I don't understand these things, therefore they're nonsensical or they don't make sense. Because if you think about it, because I, like literally everyone else, including the person criticizing me, doesn't know how most things work. Maybe they know about how toasters work or whatever my example was. Microphones, I think. Maybe they know about how microphones work. But there's probably going to be something that they don't know a whole lot about. I don't know how shoes are made. If it's not how shoes are made, then how people fish in how people used to fish in the Middle Ages or something. I don't know. There's going to be something they don't know about. Just because I don't know about things doesn't mean I think that like all these things are like incomprehensible, unintelligible, nonsensical. I don't go around thinking like medicine is nonsensical because I don't know anything about medicine. I'm not a doctor. That would be ridiculous. So when people criticize this, sorry, this isn't too related to this content, but it's
I think I've got a thought that is really related to it. But yeah, if you
it might be. I mean, because we got Qualia quietism. So I guess it is related. But when you say that, I think that's not meaningful. I don't think there's an intelligible concept to be had here. The reaction of people that are invested in that concept's alleged meaningfulness is something like, well, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that there isn't something to be understood. Or it seems like the only reason you think this isn't meaningful is because you don't get it. And that's not what I'm saying or what anybody else that's making these sorts of objections is typically saying. And for whatever reason, the people that are on the receiving end of that's meaningless type criticisms, for whatever reason, they seem to think that it's just this straightforward appeal to incredulity. Like, I'm just such a slobbering idiot that I go, I don't get it, so it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And like, I just don't do that in any other context. And it's like, think about all the other contexts where I definitely don't get it. These are topics where, look, I'm not a specialist in philosophy of mind, and I don't focus a lot on qualia quietism. Most of my stuff is directed at metaethics. But think about that. It's like a topic that I've spent years studying and talking to people, and I talk about it and write about it literally every day. Why would they think that I'm saying I don't get it? It's that I think it's not meaningful in virtue of the fact that I do get it. I think I get it, and that because I get it, I can see why they're full of baloney. It's not that I think I don't get it.
Bridge it though. I think I can.
Sorry?
I think I can bring the weave back into the philosophy of mind, though here, Lance. Right, okay. Where when you're talking about these sorts of explanations, where there are explanations that you sort of like know people have a theory, right? But you trust that there is like they're not just completely conceptually confused. Well, what are your grounds for doing so in those cases, right? And it's the fact that your toaster works, or that your medicine heals you and gets you better. It's the pragmatic success of these theories makes you think that these people do actually know what they're talking about. And now you can turn that around. So this is what I thought was interesting about what you were saying about how you can basically create an explanatory, gap between anything, because it's basically just a feature of a person's ignorance about something. Really, it's not. It's not like it doesn't. It's not a feature of things that you don't know about them or something. And yeah, but this is what people obviously do with consciousness, right? So then you've got to ask, well, what would it look, what would our grounds be by way of parity to think that these people who are talking about consciousness know what they're talking about, right? Well, presumably they'd be able to do something about it. So, people love to say like intuition pump on, say, Mary's room, right? And say, and this isn't going to be quite formally valid as a counter argument, but say, if just imagine a scenario where physicalism is true, it can't get you to being conscious, to having consciousness or something like that. But I think there's like a parity thing here, which is like, so what's the upshot of that supposed to be? Like panpsychism is true, or idealism is true, or some non-physical theory of mind is true. Like what does that theory give you, or do like can you get experiences into people's mind now you have this explanation? Are you like better at controlling your own mind? Can you can you beam thoughts or control people? I don't really know if we were supposed to have grounds here for believing that we actually have good explanations here. I would think that those explanations would be able to do something, but then again, you can just challenge my you say grounding explanations, not not pragmatic explanations. But yeah, that's what I was thinking on what.
Yeah, it just those alternative explanations, like if you reject physicalism or empiricism or pragmatism or all these sort of loosely aligned approaches in favor of panpsychism or dualism or something like that, I would start to ask questions like, but what does your theory do? How does it help me make predictions? How does it impinge on my experience in some potentially observable way? And if the answer is it doesn't, but it doesn't have to meet those standards. Those aren't the standards you use for theory selection. Then, okay, so their explanations for things satisfy some set of standards or criteria that are their own standards and criteria that I don't care about and aren't the standards or criteria I use. So, hey, my explanation meets the standards that I want it to meet. Okay. So like, and half the time, if not more so, a big part of this seems to be that it vindicates some initial intuition or impulse or inclination that those people had in the first place. And so, you know, like a really big point in favor of some non-physicalist view of consciousness is, hey, it sure as hell seems like it's non-physical. Okay, but it doesn't seem that way to me. So that doesn't count. It's not helping the view that it vindicates some intuition that I don't even have in the first place. So there's something. It's almost like these alternative views. You know, they do that thing. You paint you throw the dart and then you paint the bullseye around it. The arguments that they have happen to satisfy the criteria that they have, and it's, you know, they're a perfect match. What a coincidence. But I don't care about any of the standards that they're using or the arguments that they're using to meet those standards. Like, so even if they met the standards, I wouldn't be satisfied with that.
Right. Well, let's play a little bit. Let's get into Emerson's argument. I'll try and let a good chunk of it play, so we've got something substantive to sort of comment on. Let's go.
Further, a subject is rational in holding that the existence of their mind is more secure than the existence of other minds, because the subject has an additional source of justification for belief in the existence of their own mind. Whatever I have to support the existence of other minds, I also have for my mind, since I can observe all my physical behavior, for example, in a mirror or on a screen or with some scientific instrument. But it appears that I have something else to justify the belief in my mind.
I don't know if I agree with that or if that's true, because, you know, that caveat of in a mirror sounds very suspiciously similar to putting someone else in like an MRI machine and looking at, you know, brain scans or something, you know, like under the right conditions, it's like saying in principle, because of course we don't see, you know, I don't see my facial expressions unless I provision myself with the right apparatus to remove the asymmetry or whatever, right? Yeah.
That I do not have to justify my belief in other minds. So I think there's an epistemic asymmetry between one's own mind and the minds of others. That's how we get a problem of other minds to begin with. Here, it's not necessary to take a hard position on what that something else is exactly, just that A, it provides a source of justification for the belief in my own mind, a source of justification that I lack when it comes to the minds of others, and B, that it's private. So why believe that the extra source of justification is private rather than publicly accessible? Because if it were not private, then you could cite it to support your belief in the minds of others. But this is precisely what we've denied by accepting the asymmetry. You have an additional source of justification for the belief in the existence of your own mind that you do not have for the belief in the existence of other minds. Where could that additional justification come from other than private consciousness? Because if it weren't private, then you would also have it for others, not just yourself, and you'd be kicked back to the position of epistemic symmetry. So this is why there's a conflict between epistemic asymmetry and the rejection of mental privacy. In his
Go ahead.
So I don't want to fault Emerson for, you know, doing in speech what would, you know, be a clear mistake if written down. Right. When we speak, we're sloppy in ways that, you know, when we write, hopefully we're a lot more careful. But one way of stating what the issue is it's about impossibility, or claims of impossibility. So a lot of his language here is about what we do have access to. But the issue is about what we can have access to, or whether there's something that I have access to in my own case that no one else could possibly have access to. That's, you know, the supposed line that would separate the physicalist from the anti-physicalist. There has to be some very deep, hard difference. Not just like, well, it's kind of difficult for me to know what's going on inside of your body because you're opaque, and it's generally impolite to cut you open. I don't have your permission to do that, and even if I did, I'd need equipment that I don't have. Right? That's just difficult. It's not impossible for me to know whether your stomach is full, but it's real easy for you to know whether your stomach is full. One way you might know it is you remember having eaten right before this call started. Another way you might know whether your stomach is full is that you just feel like you just wiggle around and feel your stomach sloshing around. I can't feel that, but not because of dualism, just because my nerves aren't connected to your stomach. So he needs, for the argument to like have teeth, it really has to be about what you can do versus what you cannot do, not, as he's kind of stating it here, what as a matter of fact you do.
I mean, I don't know if you caught it, but I, sensed that Emerson was actually talking in S5 there. So, in fact, you don't deny that it's possibly necessary that, you can't access Emerson's thoughts and beliefs. That merely humbly, it's possibly the case that epistemic privacy is true.
Everything's possible.
But in S5,
including the falsity of S5.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do we think about the argument? So let's just retrace though that argument that he just gave, because I can't remember exactly like how would you kind of like formalize the premises there? Maybe if I've got a transcript, if I get a transcript.
I mean, so one way to go would be something like this. Whatever I have access to about you, I also have access about myself.
Mm-hmm.
In this kind of modal way, whatever I'm able to have access to about you, like what's going on in your stomach, I might have to cut you open or do an X-ray or whatever. All your objective physical properties that about you that I have access to, I also have access to about myself. Mm-hmm. In some cases, I might have to look in the mirror, or I might have to get an fMRI, or I have to pay somebody to cut me open.
Yeah,
but there's no
deep
asymmetry with respect to those properties between me and you. Like from my point of view, there's no asymmetry when we are looking at the physical or objective properties.
Yeah,
but there's these alleged other properties, like what it's like for me to see red, or the painfulness I feel when I'm in pain, where that is there is this like deep asymmetry. Now, what gets a little bit cloudy is what's the premise and what's the conclusion. Ultimately, that's what he wants to say, but what's supposed to be the argument for it?
It's almost like it's like a reverse private language argument or something like that, right? It's like the fact we don't use other people's private samples or something in our identification of them as being conscious. But we do use something like inference to the best explanation, and that inference to the best explanation is predicated on the fact that we already know that we're conscious by our observation of our own experience or something like that. But then I think like that's almost like question begging in a way, because the fact that you started with that in the background then, and then you kind of like reason about this other stuff that other way is kind of determined by thinking about it like that. And I would almost think about it the opposite way, where I'm like, actually, that's a really good point, Emerson. Like, but that is why I don't think, I'm like, actually, I think it's the same in both cases. Like I use your behavior, like I just observe your behavior or whatever, and I'm like, yep, you're a person, you're conscious. And I do the same for myself. Like I just do observe that I'm going on, right? I'm just like, okay, I'm existing, I'm moving, I can continue to act, I'm alive. And that's what I do, rather than that I like check a private, I don't check a private sample in my own case or in your case. It's the yeah, like it's almost like driving the consistency the other way for me, the what I think he's touching on.
So I think that he has a couple different ways of making his argument precise. And the slight differences will result in him having to field slightly different objections. For one way for him to present the argument would be to making an inference from the way things appear to the way things really are. Now, if that's supposed to be a deductive argument, well, then that would be an invalid argument. However, there are other arguments besides deductive arguments. For example, there's abductive arguments. And as he says many times, he's trying to do an inference to the best explanation. So that gets him off the hook a little bit. Like, sure, it's deductively a fallacy, but if it's not supposed to be deductive at all, then, you know, you got to figure out something else to complain about. So it might be a move from, well, things appear this way. What would it explain they're appearing this way? Well, here's this other thing. They really are that way. Now, there's a slightly different argument in this ballpark, which specifically has to do with inference, where the asymmetry has to do with when it comes to me knowing stuff about the inside of your own mind. I have to resort to inferences. Like I see you frowning, and then I'm like, what would cause frowning? Oh, I know.
Philosophy.
Philosophy. Sadness, pain. That's what. So I make an inference, but in my own case, quite plausibly, I don't make an inference. I just like feel the pain. Now, one of the things that you have to address is the possibility that you are drawing an inference. You're just not conscious of the inference.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, you could say that, but then I'd say you're repressing memories of all sorts of things. Like I find these just very dangerous inferences to
right,
unconscious.
So, but it's one possibility for him to do here.
Yeah, he can explain it away.
One is to say, like, look, it's bullshit. This unconscious inferences. There's just inferences. Either you have them or you don't, and they would be in consciousness or nowhere at all, and I don't have them. So, and then that's the form of the argument. Another way to do the argument is to grant that, yeah, maybe there are unconscious inferences, but what I'm talking about are apparent inferences. I don't appear. So again, it's similar to the first version that I talked about. The premises are about how things appear, and then there's this abductive conclusion. This dodges the fallacy accusation by abandoning any aspiration to have a deductive argument. It appears that I don't have inferences. Why might that be? Well, one possibility is that I just have this kind of direct acquaintance. So what explains the appearance is that what's really going on is this metaphysical thing, which is like this direct acquaintance relation or revelation relation or something like that.
Yeah, what isn't there a paper? Did they call it revelation? I remember there was was there a debate between like Edouard Macheray and someone on the Mind Chat podcast?
Well, Goff is a revelation fan, and Macheray was on with, I think, Michelle Liu. I don't know if she's full on revelation theorist, but that's definitely Goff's jam. He loves revelation.
Yeah, of course. So they do, like, just to clarify, that they are happy calling it like revelation as a.
Well, some people are, yes,
and some people.
Others will call it like Russellian acquaintance.
Yeah. Interesting.
But one thing that's very common is, like, amongst anti-physicalists is to hold that there's this like special kind of epistemic situation with respect to consciousness, qualia, whatever. And it's that special sort of epistemic relation that gets these anti-physicalist arguments off the ground. And that behooves physicalists to try to prevent them from claiming that epistemic relation.
And just on this point, are you could you just articulate, like, in terms of the appearance or the experience, like, is all of this according to them in the experience? You know, like what you know, like how ramified is the seeming sort of thing?
Well, one way to put it is consciousness and instances of consciousness, like a feeling of pain or seeing red. They have essences, and you can know those essences,
Right. Yeah.
either just by having the experience or by having the experience plus being rational and paying attention to the experience, right? Because maybe they want to grant that babies don't know the essences of their experiences, even though babies, they want to say, feel pain.
Yeah. Why wouldn't they?
Well, maybe it's implausible.
Yeah, because babies aren't doing
meta representations.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, like it's fairly common to see this move, like with the Kripke thing, to say like, well, I know what pains are, and like I don't just have a mere appearance of pain. I have in being appeared to painfully, I have the pain. One way to put all this to kind of like expose, I'm sure anti-physicalists are going to think I'm being a total asshole and completely unfair, but I'm going to do it anyway. So take, for example, the conceivability argument stated in terms of zombies. I could conceive of zombies, which we might state as I can't rule out a priori the possibility that there are zombies. And so therefore it's possible that there are zombies, but if it's possible for there to be zombies, then consciousness can't be identical to anything physical. The painfulness of pain can't be identical to some property, a physical property a brain has, or a brainy property. Now, there's a way of restating that argument that really kind of reveals, pun intended, what's a bit cheap about revelation and similar sorts of moves. One way to talk about like what you can conceive of is to talk about like what you know about things, right? So here would be a valid argument for anti-physicalism. I know what consciousness is, and I know that brains, purely in virtue of their physical properties, don't give rise to consciousness. Therefore, consciousness is not physical. That would be a valid argument, especially if we explicitly add the premise that if you know something, then it's true. Truth is a necessary condition on knowledge. If you stated that baldly, it's a completely question-begging argument for anti-physicalism, right? In order for it to really cut any ice, that you have this epistemic relation to zombies, it presupposes you know what consciousness is. If you know what consciousness is, then you would be in a position to know whether it's physical or not. So I know what brains are. I know what consciousness is. I know that brains don't suffice for consciousness. So anti-physicalism follows completely trivially from that. And all the interesting stuff is like, well, do you know what consciousness is? Do you? The people that are inclined towards physicalism are also inclined to thinking it's like a scientific problem, figuring out what consciousness is. We're nowhere near.
So here's the question then, Pete. Do you think that you clocked onto that before you came up with Qualia quietism, or did you come up with Qualia quietism before you and then clock onto that sort of thing going on?
I don't know. I'm tempted to say that like the Qualia quietism is the newer of the two. But
because it seems like if that characterization is right, then the Qualia quietism is very well motivated in the sense that it really touches on the key issue of what's at stake, right? Like the coherence of what is being asserted when people describe aspects of their experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit tricky because there's this thing that happens where, Dennett, just ripping off Dennett now. Dennett talks about how when you explain a magic trick, sometimes you get this reaction that like, well, that can't be the explanation because the magic trick I saw was really way more impressive than that. And now that I have the magic trick explained to me, it doesn't seem very impressive at all. In fact, the memory I have that it was an amazing trick is kind of fading. Like, I can't believe it was that impressive. But, we could, in theory, rewind the tape and, the security cam showing you at the show, watching the magician, and you were really impressed. Like, you almost passed out. It's quite obvious on video that you were impressed. And we could also prove to you that, yeah, that's the trick. The one we just explained is the one that you saw and were impressed by.
Unfortunately, in my case, there are, videos of me being very impressed by idealists and all sorts 5 or 6 years ago on the internet.
So I want to ram home the point in case it's not obvious to people what I just said about zombies. Take, for example, rainbows and the question of whether you could walk on a rainbow and whether you could conceive of walking on a rainbow and whether anyone should give a shit about whether you can conceive of walking on a rainbow. So my, let's say, my small child loves to talk about walking on rainbows and watching cartoons about walking on rainbows and quite easily are able to imagine things that they would describe as, I walked on a rainbow, or, I just saw somebody walk on a rainbow. Can they conceive of walking on a rainbow? There's a sense in which they can, but the way they're able to conceive of walking on a rainbow is by not really knowing what a rainbow is.
Yes.
They are thinking of a rainbow as something that has a definitive location in space, that when you move your body to that location in space, the rainbow's still there. It doesn't keep moving away from you. And once you get there, it occupies space and is solid enough to resist your mass. And so you can walk on it just like the way you would walk on a stone or wooden bridge.
You might say it has certain properties.
Yeah, and so one way you might describe it is to say that real rainbows don't have all those properties. And if you knew that, you would know that you can't walk on a rainbow. And one way you would express that knowledge claim is by saying, I can't conceive of walking on a rainbow. When I conceive of rainbows, I also immediately appreciate that they're not the sort of thing that you could walk on. And when I conceive of walking on something, I immediately appreciate it's not the sort of thing that could ever be a rainbow.
How do you
stated in terms of knowledge, I know what rainbows are and I know what it is to walk on something, and therefore I know you can't walk on a rainbow.
But here's what I'm seeing though, right? So I'm totally on board, and I think that's a great way of putting it. And I obviously think that's right, and I think that one side of this dispute is correct about this, but here's the problem now. Who gets to determine who has the appropriate concept in the case of consciousness, right? So in the case of the rainbow, we can defer to the physicists and what they have to say about their experiments and things like that. But in the case of philosophy of mind, can't they could just turn that around and say, you've got this sort of like weird rainbow concept of mind, and we've got the real mind is the Qualia mind.
Yeah, ultimately, I am a pragmatist, at least in the sense expressed by the Duhem-Quine thesis. You can pick anything you want and hold onto it in the face of all counter arguments, just by changing what you accept to be its entailment relations to other stuff. So you could say, like, look, I don't care about anything else. I believe that rainbows can be walked upon. Then when people say, like, well, look at this and that and the other thing, you can't walk on that, you say, well, those aren't real rainbows. Real rainbows are the ones you can walk on. Yeah, but have you ever walked on one? No, I haven't, but there are rainbow walkers. Like, you could, if you wanted to, save anything, as long as you're willing to give up other things. And sometimes the things you're giving up would be like 2 + 2 = 4.
Right. But this is what, yeah.
Some people are going to say, no, you can't give up 2 + 2 = 4. Yeah, you can, as long as you are willing to give up something else. There's nothing that you can't give up.
This is where whenever people listen to like philosophers disputing either side of any debate, really, I advise to listen carefully for the locution, either "but you wouldn't want to say" or "we wouldn't want to say that." Like, as in, you know, the sort of like one of these main argumentative strategies is trying to sort of like reach deeper and deeper into ordinary, globally accepted locutions that people would want to say in ordinary life and not want to abandon, and then say that that's kind of like an entailment of accepting a view, which is sort of, you know, I think quite a deep, actually, meta philosophical point about what's actually even going on in the dispute more generally. But yeah, I think that is, you know, in line with what you're saying there.
Yeah, and so, you know, many parties to the consciousness debate have this incredibly strong intuition of acquaintance or revelation or something like that, where like there's this like the red experience or the painfulness of the pain, that like it has to be like that, and they don't want to give that up, and they're willing to give up just about anything else. And I really like explaining things. I really, you know, at an early age got into a general kind of naturalism and saw how you could explain the seasons and chemical combination and this general sort of picture. And even though I have that hunch, like the acquaintance kind of hunch, or like I have those so-called intuitions, but I've also been around the block enough to know like how one can be fooled about those sorts of things. And I also like a good explanation, and I see some really plausible possible explanations. And I also care about things like, you know, there's a lot of people investigating consciousness scientifically, and they're making progress by not sticking with this, like what it's like phenomenal consciousness definition. And the ones that really love that what it's like phenomenal consciousness definition seem to be going nowhere. Like it. Now,
well, depends
maybe there's no point in going anywhere. But
I think both parties in that way of looking at it are confused as to what counts as progress. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think sometimes the people in the scientific tradition are not, they have better operationalized questions that they are making progress on, right? But like, they're still hunting a lot of shadows and things. Like, they've not disambiguated a lot of the stuff that was set up that they've just kind of like received conceptually about the mind in the first place. But then similarly, you know, like neural correlates type investigations. But then similarly, on the other side of the coin, I agree with you that the philosophers are also just not doing, they're not even doing anything.
I think a good scientist is a very rare thing, as is a good philosopher. But nonetheless, I'm optimistic about the possibility of goodness in those domains, and there are right, good people out there making good progress. But yes, there's a lot of people that are also just fooled, and it's easy to get fooled by some of these things. It's easy to get confused about whether you're saying something that has empirical content to it versus just like some thinly concealed triviality.
Yeah. Right. Well, let's try and get a little bit more then through the video. I think we're at about where you got to with Lance in the last video. I don't know if we've lost Lance as well.
It could, you know, one thing I'd like to do really quick is just to, in case we don't get through the whole video, like just super briefly say what's coming up. Sure. One of the things that is coming up, I don't think it gets discussed earlier in the video, but there's this like really interesting and nice line of argument that I don't know if it's original with I don't remember if it's original with Emerson or if he's drawing it from someone else, but it's pretty cool. And it's talking about the controversies that were real controversies in the history of things about animal sentience and pediatric surgery, where like people learned that, for example, curare is not an anesthetic; it's merely a paralytic, right? And the mere fact that that's something that we're able to learn gives some credence to there being some sort of epistemic asymmetry with respect to, for example, our pains. How could you, if all there was is what we have objective access to, the way we have objective access to each other's faces, then there would be no room for doubt about whether a paralyzed baby is feeling pain or not. So it's not it's not a terrible argument. Whether it could give him everything he wants is a separate thing, but that is a big thing that's coming up. Another thing coming up is he's going to explicitly tie what he's saying about privacy and asymmetry to the zombie argument.
I think with that one, I agree with you, and I think there's a lot of interesting cases in the history of psychology as well. So, like, a lot of people often like to push back on my sorts of views by talking about how evil a lot of the behaviorists were, and I'm like I agree with them as well. But often, then I'm like, you know, you can kind of like say the same thing, say for like, you know, if your theory was telling you that a person doesn't have the right cognitive representation for pain, and then you carried out their experiment and they're screaming, and then you didn't like, you know, listen to their behavior, right? You would be also kind of just doing the exact same thing. I think that there is possibly an unconsidered alternative, as you were saying, with like the, you know, the case of like early anesthetics and things like that, which is to then, you know, look at pain as laryngeal behavior, you know, or that's very I like to say it crudely just to shock people into thinking about it maybe, but you know, like to look at pain as that practice that a person does of saying, wow, I was still in pain there or something, rather than it being necessarily a sensation or something, because ultimately you know, if think about it methodologically, if these people didn't produce those reports, then you wouldn't get we wouldn't actually have modified our science in any way, right? We wouldn't have gone, this isn't doing the things that we wanted it to do. The only way we actually know now, you could still, I guess, you know, there's going to be a dispute about like yes, but then I infer behind that functional behavior that there's a sensation, a particular necessary sensation, something like that, and that's where the trickiness is maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think and again, this is probably a point that it has made, or something similar to it. Oftentimes we don't appreciate what we're imagining when we imagine something, and we don't appreciate how hard it is to imagine something. Like, for example, imagine that no kind of behaviorism was true, like not even this kind of behaviorism, that you would be able at some point to say what was happening in your mind. Imagine that you weren't ever able to say that you had been in pain.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine no one was able to say that they had been in pain. Could people still be in pain? And you might say, like, well, I could think about it. But now imagine that. Imagine that there's things that you can think about and talk about. But whenever you think about pain, what happens? You just stop talking?
Well, this is where I think,
what are we even supposed to imagine?
This is what, yeah,
total non-behaviorism.
Well, this is where, yeah, this is actually where I think this is, you know, like almost Chalmers 2D semantics type thing comes in, because it's like you're asking that question to me as a person who has been habituated into pain language, right? So I as a competent pain user am being asked a question about you know, involving imagination and so forth, right? But in that actual scenario, I think it would just be true that like pain didn't exist or nobody was in pain. But if you were to ask, you know, if you were to ask a speaker of that, this is my take on those sorts of questions. Of course, like, you know, opinions may vary. But if you ask me, of course, I might say that they're in pain, or I might not. You know, it depends on my judgments of whether they're using the behavior, the verbal behavior, in the way that I understand it as a speaker of the language, right? So it's kind of like tricky. Now, do you call that linguistic relativism or something? Like, if the language doesn't exist, the thing really has ceased to exist, like, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, we could easily convince ourselves that there's all sorts of things that we don't have language for. So we know enough about the size of the universe to know that there are, numbers of things that we could never state or write down.
But you just did.
I mean, there's ways of massaging the example. So like,
Yeah.
I could say like, there's certain quantities of things we know to be the case, but we can never write out the full decimal expansion, or no one in the, like, even if we use multiple generations of people, started speaking in generation 0, and just, when people die off, the next generation of chorus members comes in and keeps speaking. There's certain numbers that we would just never say the full decimal expansion of them. Now, of course, I could say those numbers, like literally, open quote, those numbers, close quote. But there's other sorts of descriptions that we just cannot have for things that we have reason to believe exist. So there's like, I don't want to say it's trivial, but it's kind of easy to prove that there are at least some things that could be outside of our linguistic grasp, if you're specific enough about what you mean by linguistic grasp. But to imagine that somehow people have pains and they're conscious of the pains, but they are in no way able to communicate that fact, but otherwise they're able to communicate facts, including facts about what's going on in their minds. Like once you really start thinking through the ramifications, you realize, like, maybe I'm trying to imagine a four-sided triangle here. Like that just doesn't make any sense.
Wait, sorry, could you just run through that last part again? I think my brain was not caught up with the.
You can't really imagine a four-sided triangle unless you funny business, like imagine it from the side view, right?
But I mean, sorry, the pain bit was the bit I missed, not the.
Well, imagine that people can consciously experience pain, but aren't in any way able to communicate that fact, the fact that they're in pain.
Yeah.
Well, what are we imagining? Are we imagining people that suddenly fall silent under certain situations?
Right.
And can't even tell us after the fact why they were silent?
Yeah. But this is like your rainbow example where, I feel my intuitions about language are so shaped by, thinking of it as a public behavior that, like the only way that people being in pain makes sense to me is through a public behavior, right? So I know what you mean. Like I don't, but then I'm like, is that just because I'm kind of like question begging in the?
Well, I would like to suggest to you that part of it is you're having access to things that aren't strictly speaking public behavior. You're having access to like your own dispositions to start speaking, or your memories that you were speaking a little bit ago. So some of what you have access to is not strictly speaking outwardly observable musculoskeletal behavior, but nonetheless there are certain like counterfactual relationships such that there wouldn't be anything that's inexpressible in some sense or other. You would be able to talk about it after the fact, or you'd be able to talk about it indirectly. It couldn't wholly escape everyone's ability to comment on it.
It's like trying to imagine that from a first person perspective, and it's like, what the hell even is that? Like,
that you couldn't communicate it in any way whatsoever.
What happens? You just go, you have the urge to speak, and then just that nothing happens.
Right. And what we can't find any inner cause of that, and then label that pain, like that somehow like would never occur to us.
It's very peculiar what that would even be.
One of the things that I was hoping to have time to mention, by the way, did you see Lance claimed that he had some kind of food crash, like he desperately needed food? And
I've not seen. He did say, he's in the private chat. Yeah.
Said, I'm weirdly hungry and have to eat. So I think he's fine. Just he's eating. I'm picturing a giant hoagie, but I'm sure he's winning the fight. Anyway, I was hoping to talk smack about what it's like, because
yeah, sure, feel free to.
Because I'm very tempted to the view, and this ties into Qualia quietism too, that the main instigator of all these sorts of troubles is that people have been fooling themselves for decades using the phrase "what it's like," and the closely related idea of inner ostension. And I think it's really easy to get yourself in a frame of mind where you think like, oh yeah, there's this experience I have, a painful experience or experience of seeing pain. And even if I couldn't describe it, I nonetheless can access it, at least internally, the way I might access something externally using like pointing and saying the word this.
Well, yeah.
And I think that there's a kind of I'm tempted to say illusion, even though I'm not an illusionist. I think there's a bit of a linguistic illusion, like that arises. And one way to put a finger on it is by thinking about what the finger can't do. So if I said like, hey, Nathan, what's that thing? Right, we're both in the same room. So imagine you're in the room with me, and you say, "Hey, Mandik, what's that thing?" And I say, "Well, oh, that's a hinge on a door." And you're like, "No, not that thing. That thing." And you just move your finger a little bit, and I trace the line from your finger. I go, "Oh yeah, it's a. I think it's a flag of Iceland."
Iceland, not Norway.
Okay. Right. So one thing I could do is I could figure out which thing you're talking about. When it's a medium-sized physical object, by which portion in space we could trace the line from your finger to. But now suppose that instead of picking out a flag versus a door hinge, you wanted to pick out the shape of the flag. No, we're not going private yet. We're just thinking with the outside world for now. You wanted to talk about the shape of the flag instead of the color, and you forgot the relevant words for each. Just pointing at the flag and saying, not that, this. If you forgot the word for shape.
Yeah, how would you pick it out?
Versus the word for color, just saying that over and over again is not going to communicate it to me. You might nonetheless like be exercising a concept internally that you're just having tip of the tongue phenomenon with. Right, you forgot literally the words shape and color, but you still have the concept of shape and color. So you are able to point to the shape of the flag versus the color of the flag in your mind because you're thinking using the concept shape of the flag.
Well, hang on. If we just pause a second,
that color.
So point about sort of like theory ladenness of experience here, right? Like what's the difference? Is there a difference here? Yeah,
not yet. Like we don't have to bring theory into it.
Okay.
Ultimately, I think we should, because what else would a concept be?
Yeah, what does it mean
knowing
to have
a bunch
shape?
of stuff?
Yeah.
Right, like to know what a shape is, you have to at least know some stuff. Like, well, a shape is something that you could define on a plane, which is itself maybe a thing you could define in terms of two collinear points plus some point not on that line. That would define a plane, blah, 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 right? There's going to be more always that you could say about what a concept is. And that set of things is like a little theory. So part of having some concept of birds is they have some kind of theory of birds. You can't just like, just have this single atomic. This is somewhat controversial. Nonetheless, I don't think you could just have a single atomic concept of birds that just allows you to think of birds. You can't think about anything else in the whole universe, right? We don't have concepts one at a time like that. But my point is just about pointing and the word this and how powerless it is, especially when you're talking about multiple properties of one and the same object.
Well,
with respect to two different objects located in two different portions of space, you could just move your finger and keep saying this.
Is this not in a way, at least how I'm interpreting what you're saying here, though, is almost again motivating towards pragmatist type views, because it's when you think about this.
We'll get to
sans
pragmatism.
communicative
We're not it's not pragmatism yet. In fact, it's not
'cause I'm
even
thinking,
public. It's not even the private language argument yet.
well,
We
what I
could
mean,
get there.
sorry. Well, maybe if just I'm thinking is, we can go on with this if we're embodied, right, and able to trace around a shape or so. Like there's sort of ways that I'm thinking. It's when we're communicating about this situation, but all we have are the resources of the language, disconnected from our embodiment and our ability to.
Right, but I'm still going to be able to change the example.
Okay.
Right, so you like, okay, instead of pointing, I'm like tracing, right? So that's going to make it more about shape than about color.
Yeah,
Well, now I could say, well, what if you were trying to point at rectangularity versus rectilinearity, right? Tracing rectilinearity and tracing rectangularity is the same tracing.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be what you're pointing at on the one hand, and then multiple properties you might be trying to attend to on the other. And the only way you could pick out in your attention what the different properties are is by having different thoughts, different concepts. So in the case of the flag, when you want to you want to point to the color and not the shape of the flag, you have to be thinking color versus shape. You can't just be thinking that.
Could you
that it's got to be that color versus that shape.
I see.
Are you with me so far?
I think so, but I think I now need an account of a concept. If that,
a concept is roughly anything you're able to think about. One way into a concept is it's kind of related to thoughts, the way words are related to sentences. It's kind of like knowing how to use a word. So if I have a concept of birds, I know how to use the word bird, or I know how to do the kind of thinking that would be expressed in making bird utterances. So there's a way of being kind of non-committal about what concepts are.
I think that's where I'm.
But the basic idea that I'm trying to get at is that a bare demonstrative word like that, or a pointing finger plus the utterance of the word that, will not get you by themselves your attention onto the shape versus the color. You have to accompany that with some sortal concept, like that shape versus that color. But that's happening in your thought.
Well, I see what you're saying,
but wait, here's the good part.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about so-called phenomenal properties.
Yeah.
Or what its likeness is, right? These are supposed to be properties of sensations or properties of experiences. But which properties? There's a way of using sensation or experience that a physicalist, a behaviorist, a functionalist could be fully happy with. Like there's these events, these things that happen, like they happen in response to stimuli, right? They have lots of properties. Like, for example, they have the property of being like the 23rd reaction you've had to a red thing today. It has the property of being in a state that Bertrand Russell was once in, right? There's all these different properties, but the qualia realists think that there's some particular properties that they can zero in on, and a class of properties that unites them. So there's this higher order property, the property of being a phenomenal property, the property of being phenomenally conscious. And then there's these specific ones, which is like phenomenal redness, phenomenal painfulness. And they can't give you a definition for any of those things. Or at least they can't give you a non-circular definition. And they soothe themselves by saying, well, at least I could point to it inside my mind. But the pointing can't be anything besides thinking of it. And you got to be thinking of it using one concept versus another. You have to be conceiving of it in some way other than the 23rd thing that happened to Bertrand Russell, or the 17th time today I've been stimulated by a ripe tomato. There has to be some, we might say, mode of presentation or concept or just simply a way of thinking about it. But that invites the question, like, well, what is the way of thinking about it? Are you
I do wonder.
Are you thinking about shape, or are you thinking about color?
Well, this is what I wonder with the concept, though, as well. It's like I'm like in, you know, like in the mode of presentation or the concept or whatever that's supposed to be, right? That's like a representation, and
right, and it's a representation of a phenomenal property. But what does that mean? What is a phenomenal property? You can't just say, well, it's that.
Yeah.
Because
That's what I'm saying.
Because a bare that is useless. You have to accompany the that with the concept. So what's the concept? And if you tell me the concept is, well, the concept of phenomenal property, the question is, well, what's that concept?
Yeah. I see where you're going with this. I'm just trying to understand where you're resolving it. You know, that's what.
Well, the resolution is to say that people have fooled themselves into thinking that they have access to something via bare pointing.
Mm-hmm.
Really,
right. So it's not the
really what
extension,
they're doing.
It's the concept. They're just reproducing.
Yeah, they're accompanying the bare pointing with this concept that's actually totally an empty concept.
Okay.
Because if they were conceiving of it as like, the reaction I usually am in response to shape versus the reaction I usually am in response to color, well, that actually, what they just said, is something you could give a functional definition of. We could open you up and decide in an objective way, well, what is the reaction you usually are in when stimulated with color versus stimulated with shape? We could figure out whether a robot is in a similar state.
Yes.
Right? They need some kind of private thing.
Yeah.
That is the thing that they know privately.
There's a place here where
I'm prepared to grant that to them. Like, okay, just think to yourself, like, what is the thought? And if you're just thinking to yourself that, it's that, not that. So in some sense, this is more powerful than the private language argument. The private language argument is saying, like, you've got to be able to talk about it. Otherwise it's bullshit. This is saying you can't even think about it to yourself. And that's why it's bullshit. You have fooled yourself into thinking.
Yeah, or the degree to which you do produce this language, it's parasitic on ordinary concepts that you already have, right? And you're just sort of like doing something weird with them.
Yeah, I think ultimately, what I'm saying, I could plug into a pragmatist point of view that says, like, yeah, the only thoughts that you can think are the thoughts that you could also give definitions for in some kind of sense. You could relate it to other thoughts, and ultimately nothing will screen off identifying it with objective stuff. Nothing will prevent you from saying, you know what, all of this is ultimately not private.
Yeah.
The only way to build this kind of wall behind which acquaintance and revelation takes place is if there's some kind of like pointing, and it's more than just pointing. It's a pointing that gets at the essence.
Yeah, but how could that be correct?
How could that be? Then you've got to be able to think of which thing you are taking to be the essence. You've got to.
Is the problem here almost one of like mechanism as well? That's what I'm wondering. Like what is the problem at its core? Because even in in the way that you're thinking about these concepts and things, I don't know if this is the right way of thinking about it, but I'm often then trying to like think of it like mechanism, and I'm thinking like spatially of pictures of like hands pointing at things, or mechanism like grasping a concept and placing it in relation with a thing or something. And is it just that because these private phenomenology samples are so that there's like no constraints on how to like imagine what they're doing in that inner world. You can't mechanistically like decide that it's been applied correctly or something inwardly here.
I don't know if I want to say that, because I think a lot of what I'm trying to say, a substance dualist could agree with.
Yeah, that's true. I can see that from what you said.
So, I would just talk a little bit about like ordinary stuff, like trying to teach a baby the difference between red and blue. right?
Mm-hmm.
I might want to first get them to, acknowledge that there's a difference. This is different from this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not different from this, right? And then we could move along and then say things like, okay, so the way things seem to you, you're not just learning that this is different from this, but the way things seem to you in the one case is different from the other case. And so now you're getting them to kind of appreciate how in order to be sensitive to differences out there have to be differences in here.
I think that's the thing I'm struggling with.
By the way, I could be neutral at that point about whether in here means like inside of a Cartesian solve.
Yeah.
Versus a literal spatial in here, like inside of your brain somewhere. So I'm not presupposing at least that much ontology. A lot of what I'm talking about here, like a substance dualist could say, like, yeah, right. In order for a baby to be able to learn, like, well, this is different from that, there has to be differences in their mind.
I think I misspoke in the mechanism. Like, when I say mechanism there, I don't mean. What I mean is like, because we're sort of like talking of trying to conceive something and what is like possible versus impossible in our conception. And like, at least for me, as I'm imagining stuff, I guess the constraints I'm placing on my imagination are something like spatial mechanistic rules of representing things pictorially to myself somehow, or something like that. And so I'm just having a really hard time understanding what it is I'm supposed to imagine with the privacy case.
Part of what I'm talking about might be conveyed by like the poverty of pictures. So a picture of a blue rectangle is simultaneously going to picture the rectangularity and the blueness. So in being able to think about the rectangularity versus the blueness, you're going to need more than a picture, or you're definitely going to need more than that picture.
Yeah.
So it's very tempting to say that you've got this other thing happening in the intellect. You've got the concept, which is kind of word-like. Just like you can have the concept of red versus the concept of vermilion, or the concept of very light shade of red. You just have the concept of red. We have the word red versus the word or the phrase light shade of red. If all we have is the word this, and if you didn't even have hands or anything to point with, you just sat there and said this, how would I know what you're talking about? When you are able to point your finger, I can narrow it down.
Yeah, in the visual
somewhat.
field.
Yeah, because there's spatial differences, and so we could presume you to be implicitly deploying concepts of the spatial differences. So there's an implicit description of, the difference between that thing versus that thing it's the one that's closer to the window, or the one on the right.
It's as if you told that. It's as if you told someone to close their eyes and then you said, now this.
Exactly. It's a blind pointing.
Yeah.
And then when you open your eyes and you have the red experience, if you have thought, the capacity to think of the difference between red versus very light red versus vermilion, then you could attend to the redness versus the vermilionness versus the phenomenality versus its being visual. Those differences in attention are not a difference in moving your eyeballs, or a difference in moving your finger. It's a difference in moving your thoughts. You're thinking one thing versus the other.
No, I have a difficulty here. Yeah.
And so the question arises, like, well, what is the content of the thought?
Yes. Yeah.
You should at least be able to answer that for yourself.
Well, I don't know that I can.
When you're thinking of phenomenality in general versus phenomenal redness versus phenomenal light redness, what's like
for me?
What's the content of the phenomenal part?
Well, this is the thing, is that for me, I actually don't know anymore. Like, I feel like maybe I'm just lost in the source, right? But I genuinely don't know anymore that there is like I can produce words, right? Is what I feel like.
That's my point. We have these words, and we fooled ourselves into thinking that the words mean things.
And by thing here, you mean sensation or what? Like maybe I'm missing when you say we fool ourselves into thinking the words mean things. Like what is thing there? Maybe it's just the last bit that
it's just that broad anything at all. Like it's actually.
Oh yeah, as in so words mean things as in they discreetly mean.
Well, so here's one way of thinking about meaning.
Yeah.
Meaning is just shorthand for certain moves that we could make in a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to start here because a lot of people will just say, no way, we're not following you. We want to be realists about meaning, or we want to think meanings are like thoughts or ideas or something like that. But really, ultimately, what I think meaning is something like it's a word that we would use in certain conversations where the conversation is breaking down in some sort of way.
I guess just what I'm finding.
Let me just say a little bit more here. So you and I might be having a conversation about book binding, something that you know more about than I do, and then you talk about like pages and covers. I'm like, and then you start talking about folios. I'm like, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Because I've never heard the word folio before. So I use the word meaning to do some conversational repair and to invite you to help get the conversation back on track.
Right.
So now you could say something about what folios are. You could say it's a collection of pages. And I'm already comfortable with the word pages. I'm not going to call you out when you say the word pages. So if you explain to me what folio is in terms that I'm already happy with, I'm not going to call them into question, then you have satisfied my request to give me the meaning. And none of this requires there to be such a thing as meanings, or our concepts to have definitions, or even for our concepts to be theories. There just has to be this possibility to do conversational repair in this certain sort of way. This is all consistent with every definition in some sense being a circular definition. But if I ask you what a folio is, and you answer me by using some other word, I also don't.
Yeah, then I can place words in correspondence with words, and I've got it.
Yeah.
I can go on. Yeah.
So if you tell me something that just has a circularity depth of 1 or 2, and all the terms that you're using are interdefined with each other, and I don't know what any of them are.
Yeah, what do I do with this?
Yeah. You're like, oh, a folio is kind of like a
I'll sit down in a philosophy conversation saying consciousness, qualia, what it's like. Yeah.
So the big conversation about consciousness is a big.
It's how do we connect it?
Breakdown, right? So you've got a bunch of people saying like, hey, we're requesting some conversational repair. You say phenomenal consciousness. You tell us that like thinking about your own thinking, or representing the way the world is, or having these certain functional states, that's not real consciousness. That's not phenomenal consciousness. So, okay, tell us what phenomenal consciousness is.
Yeah, they say, and they just say what it's like. They're
going to say what it's like, and you're like, oh, what it's like. Well, I know
what are you telling me? Yeah,
I know what the Eiffel Tower is like because I know the shape of the Eiffel Tower. Like, no, we mean this special phenomenal sense of what it's like. And motherfucker, you're going in a circle now.
I see. Yeah, so the request is like really a request to say, okay, like tell me what like why do I need this? Like you're selling something. Why do I need what you're selling? Kind of. It's not exactly what you're saying, but it's quite close to that, because it's like, look, I've already got my cup. I've already got my white cup and my blue cup and my red and I've already got all these things. So what are you giving me now?
That's right. And by the way, I'm not saying that everything has to be done in a public conversation. I'm just introducing that as a model for something that could also be applied in an individual case. In the privacy of your room, you could ask yourself, do I really know what the fuck I'm talking about? Or am I just like going in these little circles inside of my own mind, and I haven't noticed that I'm actually not thinking anything?
Or am I
thinking about words?
am I so caught up ruminating in that discourse and being reinforced in that rumination by a set of practices upheld by academic philosophers that I'm not realizing I'm not doing anything with it? Yeah.
So I had a concern I wanted to raise. Sorry, I've been absent. I'm not feeling well, and I'm trying to deal with it with food.
I have to make
and
a
I
hard
decided-
stop in 2 minutes. So
Yeah,
Me too as
and
well,
I had.
so don't worry. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, cool. So I guess because we have 1 minute. So one of the things I'm seeing from people when if you make these arguments like, hey, I think that type of discourse or that terminology is meaningless, is they'll say, well, me and my expert colleagues, we understand it. So maybe the problem is you. So Pete, do you have like a reaction to that kind of response?
No, you don't understand it. You guys just haven't bothered questioning it.
So
But
the
the
reaction I
failure-
get from people is, are you saying all of these experts are wrong? So it's like most people in the field, most of the experts. So how it's very arrogant, presumptuous of you to suppose that you have identified an error that all the experts are making.
And just to build on it, this
Well,
is similar
hold on
to
a
what
second.
this-
It's
okay,
not
sorry.
like I'm a lone warrior who, the only person who's saying this stuff. There are lots and lots of people that have been dead for decades that have been saying things like this, and some of this has been building on the shoulders of giants that are fighting against other giants. And so, yes, there are some very, very smart people that are wrong about some things. But there's also some very, very smart people who aren't me, but agree with me. And so I'm just, I'm on this one particular team versus the other team. I've got, I think, some original things to add, but it's not like, I'm just like some crank in his attic and he's the only one who thinks that,
He says in his
ultimately
attic.
everything is made out of pepperoni. So that's what I say to them. But I also want to point out, like, that there's lots and lots of things I myself have turned out to be wrong about, and they were actually trivial things. I remember an argument I once got in with somebody when I was an undergrad. I had this friend who was a graduate student doing his dissertation on mathematical logic. He already had a PhD in math, was now getting a PhD in philosophy. I knew a little bit of logic, and I had this big argument with him because I'm an idiot, and I thought that P therefore Q and not Q therefore not P were two completely different statements with different logical properties. And it really seemed to me like I was right. It seemed to me that I was right strong enough that I would argue against this guy. And then eventually I came to see that, like, I was totally fucking wrong. Like, it was easy to prove to myself that I was wrong. But in that moment, like, I really thought, like, yeah, there's a difference here. These are two different thoughts expressing two different truths.
Here is the question, though. How did you find out? How, in that case, how did you find out you were wrong? And how do you know that this case isn't like that? Do you see what I mean? Like,
I thought about it. I thought about it for a while. I learned about, like, how you would establish things like this and using truth tables, and I accept the truth tables as a decent way of doing it. And I came to decide that for now on, I agree with that person. But ultimately, there's no knowing.
The ground.
Ultimately, the Lewis Carroll, what the Achilles said to Tortoise, right? Any kind of so-called deductive argument or deductive proof is always going to be based on some other premises that either you accept or just haven't got around to questioning. And Duhem-Quine thesis rules the day. You could, if you wanted to, say, like I could have said, you know what, I'm right, and I'm going to construct a new logic around it, and it's going to be like, the Mandik logic, and its central axiom is going to be, if P then Q is not equivalent to if not Q then not P. I could have done that, and a lot of people would have said I'm crazy, and I wouldn't have had much to really show for it, but I could have done that.
This is sort of what I'm saying. Isn't the contemporary philosophy of mind, though, Sort of like the truth table isn't what its likeness. Sort of like the truth table. That's what I'm. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's so ubiquitous in Phil of Mind 101. In fact, I mean, maybe it isn't. I don't actually have good data on this, but
it's sort of like it, but it's not very much like it. With the truth table, you can churn out a whole bunch of really neat, cool stuff and do neat, cool things with it. With what it's like, all you get is you get to say what it's like over and over again. And every so often you'll say, like, you can't know what a bad is like. You don't get shit. You could. It's like the most boring religion ever. There's a few tenets. There's no promises of what you get at the end. You just you say the creed to your friends over and over again.
Well,
that's all you get.
Goff's trying to make it.
You don't even get a theory. But he doesn't have a theory. His theory is you take all of physics and then you say it's conscious.
Yeah, no, well,
That's
but now you get Jesus
theory.
And hymns and everything in
but
his
you
improved.
Don't. You just take Jesus and you put it's conscious in front of it. You don't get anything new from it.
I see what you mean. Yeah. Sorry,
and I'm not saying it, like, in order to do something good, it has to be physical. It has to be public. But like, for God's sake, do something besides just repeat the same mantra over and over again of like, oh, well, it's private. Like, well, I know I've got non-physical what it's likeness. Phenomenal. Do something. And the sad fact is that a lot of people have been like wasting a lot of time and effort. Like, there's a lot of people in science that think this is how you study consciousness, that you start with Nagel, what its likeness-ism. And it's a total dead end that people have spent a lot of money and time on. Meanwhile, there's really cool shit. Like, for example, what's blind sight? Like, what's going on there? That's really cool. Yeah. How does inattentional blindness work, and what sorts of ways could we, further enhance our ability to have good experiences and reduce our proclivity to have bad ones? There's all sorts of great things we could be doing with the science of consciousness. So let's do them. That's what I say. Let's do cool shit. But yeah, if you wanted to, if you wanted to say, like, look, bottom line, I don't care about anything else except like acquaintance or revelation, or like I could conceive zombies. There's no argument against that. Really, if you make that your central axiom, the argument against that is to point out to everybody, well, look, they made that their central axiom. Isn't that silly?
Yeah, we'll need to start have an inquisition to get rid of them. We'll have consciousness martyrs.
The robots will kill them. The robots will win it.
I can just imagine Emerson,
without argument.
I can just imagine Emerson going to his death in the face of AI.
You're not conscious. Like. We don't care. We don't care.
Yeah. Well, as Lance was saying, your hard cutoff. Thank you very much for coming on, but the time, we've probably got to wrap up. Anything you want to say, just to final words? Nope. Okay.
Is that even Lance?
Is Lance even? Lance is frozen in time.
Totally I thought you were asking Pete, not me.
I was asking Pete, but yeah, I think he got freaked out because you were so still.
Oh,
yeah, I wasn't sure if the video was working. That was amazing, Lance. I've been speaking nonstop for I don't know how long. So
it was Lance. No, it was good. It was also good to listen to. It was actually pretty convenient for me to not feel super well. I was like, cool, I get to listen to a conversation. So yeah, we didn't get into the video at all, so we have to come back and get into the video. So.
We should have a part 3. It's a good video, and I have nothing but love for Emerson Green. I think he's doing good stuff on the internet. He's just wrong about everything.
I think we're actually further behind the video.
We went back
from where you finished it in part 1. So,
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Wait, are
The
we're
Xeno-
behind where part 1 was? We actually went
I
backwards.
think we're behind where you finished in part 1.
We should
What
go backwards next time and just
What
get
an
back to the
excellent
beginning.
metaphor for the whole field.
Yeah. Okay, right. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you for watching.
Yep.
You know, go to Pete's Substack. What's the actual name? Something Void, right?
Drawn to the Void.
Drawn to the Void. Lance
Yep.
Independent. Digital Gnosis. All our things. I'll put links
Yep.
to them in the description.
Check the description. It's got all the
Awesome.
links.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
All right, everybody. Bye.